everybody. I think we'll get started. We're just a couple minutes over, and I do want to be respectful of people's time and all this sort of fun stuff. So, yeah, thank you all for showing up today. If you are not already acquainted with me, my name is Ramsey Eckhart. I am a current philosophy bachelor's seeking student at the university, and I'm also getting a minor in religious studies. So here's a little bit of an intersection of thinking about Catholic liturgy and its place within Northern Italy. Right, so you all see the title, The Last Stand Against the Roman Standard. Ramsey, what does this mean? Yes, it's a little bit trying to grab the attention of the eyes and be like, what? That sounds like a lot. It's very qualified, so one of the big things is tracing all the way back to St. Ambrose in the 4th century. If you're not already familiar with him, you might be familiar with the name Augustine. He was his teacher. So, way long ago, there's this deposit of faith that gets started in northern Italy, and it is one, maybe debatably two, rites that has been practiced from its inception all the way through all these councils and all these actions of everything, and still exists in the modern day and is still thriving as a full community, again, celebrating every single week, all year long. So, first of all, I thought I might get us started with a little bit of an introduction into what it's like being a Latin Catholic, but not a Roman Catholic. And so one of my buddies from the church in Milan that I would attend to graciously was able to do a little interview. So just have a look at this.
But even like good faith Protestant and Catholics sometimes just naturally say Roman Catholics or RCs even. And I get it because of course we're in communion with Rome, but I feel that detracts a little bit from the richness of our liturgical tradition, and not just liturgical, but in general, we have so many different churches, and before the Roman Rite was kind of codified, there were even more different forms of the liturgy. The Ambrosian Rite is one of the very few in the West that survived, because it was at least 200 years old when the decree came out, etc. So you say myself Catholic, but among all Catholics, I'm an Ambrosian Catholic. So there's a little bit of pride in that, as there is for anything else. It's not to the exclusion of everything else. It's just I think a natural part of one's identity in any dimension. One tends to identify the most with the most local level of analysis. So.
Yeah. So thinking about, as we're approaching this conversation, how people view their own religious identity, right? There's ways in which we can talk about, like, this is what it means to be a Catholic, or even what this means to be an Orthodox Christian, or even, a practitioner of Judaism, right? All these sorts of things all come down to, at the end of the day, when we're analyzing things from a religious studies point of view, how each individual classifies themselves. And so I'm not going to be super polemical on what makes everything, but I'm going to use the analysis. First, we'll have a little view here at a lot of different rites. So, of course, these are all cropping out of different places. And the majority of them, supermajority, being the Western Catholics, the Latin Catholics, and the Ambrosians are included as even smaller than that 2% within the greater 98. I'm going to actually go to this first. So through the lens of Pierre Bourdieu. And so Pierre Bourdieu was a big sociologist, not particularly anybody who was interested in religion, but looking at what religion did for society. And I think this can help just give a very level playing field for analysis. So backing up to all this, we're going to think about a lot of different things. These are things that I experienced in my time in Milan, as many of you are tired of hearing of. And so basically, we got a little bit of different practices, like Lenten vestments, instead of being purple, if you're used to that in the Roman Rite, they're instead black, since it's thought to be more penitential. Or the big parade through the streets, there was traffic held up for probably a good mile or so, and everyone's going, "Chi morto? Who died?" And we're like, nobody. This is a procession of a feast exalting the body of our Lord, as we believe, right? And so then, lastly, I'll mention there's, as many of you are aware of, this tension between the Tridentine, or the style of the Mass from around the 16th century that was codified, as was referenced in the video, between that form of an expression and the one from the mid to late 20th century. And so this also exists within the Milanese tradition, albeit somewhat parallel thing. So there's only one church left in Milan that practices this older style. And that was one that I was familiar with a lot of those people there, as well as with some other chaplaincies and all that sort of thing. So that roadmap, looking at this again, lens and study, I'm going to get into what exactly the question that I'm solving here is. How can the Ambrosian Catholics maintain their identity throughout the movement of time? Because again, they want to have this local self, not we are the same as the Roman Catholics, right? It's about this local identity of how we do things here in Milan. And so it's just going to be giving options, right? It's not my place, especially as someone who isn't even a resident of Milan, to say how they should execute these things. But it's things to consider, and I think good for a scholarly standpoint. So, first of all, I want to popularize this rite, because it's scattered throughout documents, if you read from the Latin Church, from the Vatican, but no one is really familiar at all with what it is. So educating people on the existence of it is first and foremost what ought to happen. And then I'll establish sort of what makes an Ambrosian unique, and that's going to be using the theory of Pierre Bourdieu, as well as some liturgical documents and stuff. This is going to be sort of like the more musical and like at-your-face presentation, and I will have my paper that anybody can read, which will get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty that I don't want to bore everybody with right here. So Bourdieu has this idea of the habitus, so the identity, behaviors, tastes, and dispositions. So this is something like when we as Americans have something that unites all of us as Americans as opposed to Canadians or Mexicans, right? We have a sense of what it is that makes us that. But even within subgroups, right, within your family, you have your sort of family habitus, right? Even with your friends, you have that sort of identity as well. So that's going to be that term there as I use it conventionally. Doxa, doxa, or doxa, there's a lot of different ways to say it. It's this idea from Pierre Bourdieu that it's this, a usually unknown knowledge within a society. The popular one that we were using in our senior level religious studies course was individualism, right? In the United States, we have this underlying individualism in which it's like, we need to be like the self-sufficient man or woman, right? We need to be able to do things ourselves, and we sort of like stay in our own lane, and we have our own stuff that's ours and not anybody else's. So a lot of these things that just sort of run underneath the currents that maybe we're not even aware of. The Greek Orthodox Church has put this forward. You'll see in the words like doxology when it's praise to the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That is something like a proper worship as well, which is something I think is worthy of note to make in that. So the doxa of the Ambrosians can sometimes tend to be counter-Roman, as you'll see as I continue. And lastly, for Bourdieu, looking at these types of capital, right? We have social, so that's going to be things like networks, relations, and influences, and all this sort of stuff that is really just how they talk and interact in that political sphere. The economic, so you might think about the high-classness versus the low-classness of certain groups in society. Cultural, thinking about all the things that everything is embodied by, like sort of what makes it so rich, right? You can go somewhere that isn't economically rich, but there seems to be that thing about the people there, right? You're just steeping in it. And then symbolic, this idea of prestige, legitimacy, and recognition. Bourdieu sort of paints the picture of this as something very transcendent and very difficult to really pin down by any empirical measurement. So the habitus of the Ambrosian Rite, thinking about the figurehead of the Archbishop of Milan, quick little history thing about St. Ambrose, is that he was one of the first high-class, if not the first high-class society, like in society, person to become a bishop of the Catholic/Orthodox churches. And so he, being a very strong, influential figure, not only was good for the church in his preaching, his orating, but also in the way in which he sort of held back a lot of the other political forces to sort of keep the particularity of the Milanese Rite. Pragmatism, so Ambrose, and as you see Right in here, it's at the bottom of the stack, that's not the best. Charles Borromeo, the bishop at the time of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, both were very adamant about being useful in people's lives. Not preaching these things that, esoteric theology, essence and energies distinctions, transubstantiation, terms that many of you might be familiar with, but rather getting at what does it mean to live the good Christian life. Ash Sunday, I mentioned this idea of protesting against Rome in a former fashion. You'll notice that if you go to Milan, they don't have Ash Wednesday. They sprinkle ashes on your head on Sunday because they see this as something that holds to their tradition, which is also more closely affiliated with the start of Lent in the Byzantine Rite as well, and a lot of the Eastern rites. And so with that, again, this biculturalism, the idea that, you could maybe even say triculturalism, that the Greek and the Latin views, so very similar to a lot of what you see with the Byzantine Rite, with the Roman Rite, and with some of the ancient Gallican from France rites. With Ambrose himself actually having been one of the few fathers who was bilingual in both Greek and Latin for his time. So similarly, I said Lent follows more of that Eastern practice, so you'll notice that even Advent follows that 6-week format instead of the 4 weeks that most people are used to in the Roman Rite. And this is a brutal paraphrasing, but let them keep to their own custom, St. Ambrose, this idea that when he goes to Rome, he does as they do. That's where we get the other fun one, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. It's a little bit of a twisting of the words, albeit, but the essence is there. Right? And so the idea about the Ambrosian Rite is that it's, again, still the same general Italian area, but very distinct. So there's a lot with this rough timeline because in terms of early sources, we don't have much. Right? We have a lot of key little pieces, right, within early 1st and 2nd century authors that often get used. But in terms of everything around Ambrose himself, even in the 4th century, there's a little bit of evidence, but not too much to get the whole picture. And then we'll see the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, and as well as 20th century reforms. Again, you'll see the language, something like Vatican II era, that's to anchor it. Note that the Ambrosian Rite doesn't exactly play by the same rules as the Roman Rite with that. So 1st through 4th century, we see a lot of different liturgies from the different traditional apostolic sources. So you'll see a lot of different ones like you see on screen, with Justin Martyr giving us a very detailed way in which liturgy goes in Rome. But we also see that there are other developing traditions. And so a lot of these people are developing parallel understandings that form under different cultural contexts. Right? So as they're doing that, they get particular things, and I know this might be hard to see, and again, I don't want to have to read through all of this, but some of the highlights here is that within the Milanese church, you would notice that there were people who were part of the school of St. Ambrose, so this is after he'd already passed, who were going and giving the offerings, like in the Gospels when the boy offers the bread and the fish, right? And so in this early form of it, these people who, usually old men and old women of the school of St. Ambrose, would come up and give it, and they'd actually use white wine. What? Well, I've seen that once in my life, I think, and that's about it. So very, very rare practice, right? But this is how they wanted to do things. And you even look into the details, and you'll notice how everything's a little bit different. Even giving a kiss to the maniple, an old, sort of retired, by and large in the West, liturgical vestment for the priest. So something else that you'll notice is very similarly, especially my most familiarity with the Eastern rites is going to be with the Byzantine Rite, that in their prayer intentions they still follow a similar prayer intention, Lord have mercy. Prayer intention, Lord have mercy. And so a lot of this formula stuff sort of seems like an intermixing between all of these different traditions. And we also see a very important part within the 4th century was resolving this problem of the divinity of Jesus as it relates to what we now call God the Father. Right? So from a political standpoint, there were a lot of people who had divergent views, and the one that is actually held today was the minority. So in a way to weaponize against that position, they put it in the liturgy, right? there's the phrase in Latin, lex orandi, lex credendi, how you pray is how you believe. So if everybody got to praying, believing in this Trinity, then that's what people would start to believe. So you see on the right here, if you were to skim through it, this emphasis of like all three in this Godhead all together, and this is scattered throughout the liturgical documents. And one last thing that I'll note, an interesting bit being the Lord be with you. You might chant it, the Lord be with you, and with your spirit. Kyrie eleison, Kyrie eleison, Kyrie eleison, is what they would regularly do if you went to a church right now. So there's a little bit of a different way in which this is celebrated, which definitely emphasizes a lot of repetition. A lot of repetition and a lot of this mixing. So then we get to the Protestant Reformation, skip a good chunk of 1,000 years. We get to the Protestant Reformation in which a lot of people are just sort of doing whatever they want, right? They're saying, this is the way that we need to practice, this is the way we need to believe, this is the way we need to operate in all these different ways. And so Charles Borromeo, who's the Archbishop, really puts his foot down, right? Along with the Council of Trent that puts a lot of standardizations into everything. There's this sort of this liturgical free-for-all that needs cleaned up. But in order to keep the identity of the Ambrosians, Charles Borromeo kind of refused a lot of Roman imports. So for example, the order of the liturgy mirrors more the Byzantine tradition than it does the Roman. Because he said, this is something we've been doing for a very long time and you're not going to take this away from us. Right? So things like where we put the creed, not doing that. We're going to use our prayers, the Ambrosian canon, right? So these prayers over the Eucharist, we're keeping those, right? We're not doing anything that the Romans want in these regards. And he also wanted a lot of people to get into the habit of preaching, right? There was a big part about how a lot of priests would go and they would read the gospel, and then they'd close it and sit down, and then get up and continue the liturgy. Right? Charles Borromeo had a big thing. He said, be who you promised to be. Right? And if these bishops, these priests were promising to be the spiritual caretakers of these people, he said, you gotta buckle down and actually do it, all right? They won't know anything if you don't give them anything. And so this is in likeness to a practice that you see in Jerusalem, and a very, very important early document from a pilgrim from France. Her name is Egria, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And so she was going around and finding this practice to be very surprising, right? And so we sort of take for granted how much preaching there are, you know, whether it be from Catholic churches, Protestant pulpits, all these sorts of things, that these people were just sort of going through the motions of liturgical processes. So with that, you know, Charles Borromeo had to also reform the priests in their conduct. So as a form of noble simplicity, we think about the document from Vatican II, Sacrosanctum Concilium, which is primarily on liturgy. This reads, the rites should be distinguished by a noble simplicity. They should be short, clear, and unencumbered by useless repetitions. And for the Milanese tradition of faith, this might be something like a triple blessing, right? We're all used, many of us in the Roman Church are used to a single blessing at the end, whereas there might be like one here, one here, one here, a triple formula, right? They should be within the people's power of comprehension, and normally should not require much explanation, right? I was even explaining that bit there. So there was a thought that this change should also be implemented within the Ambrosian Rite. Eucharistic prayers, we saw a lot of Roman-inspired ones as well as new authored Ambrosian ones. The 3-year cycles, similarly to the change in the lectionary, to the readings that happen at every single Mass, they now started to adopt a parallel, again not identical to the Roman Rite, but a parallel 3-year cycle system. A universal calendar in which a lot of the feasts were now the Roman feasts, not particular ones that they had venerated. And you'll notice within this 5th point, the less ancient music, that just as in opening up to the vernacular, whether or not you agree with this position, there's a lot less use of the ancient Ambrosian chant versus something like a plain chant, which is used by a lot of people today. And then the sign of peace as well being extended to all of the people in attendance, not just for like the priests and the deacons and the subdeacons who are at the altar altogether. So some Eastern influences, flashing back a little bit to that 4th century, back where Ambrose was. So St. John Chrysostom, whose liturgy is celebrated by all of the Greek churches and the Russian churches and a lot of basically the Eastern Orthodox and the Eastern Catholics, they have a big idea that started within the Constantinopolitan tradition of having this antiphonal psalmody, this going back and forth. You even see this in writings in like Origen in the 3rd century. But that they're really coming together in song to glorify God and to really try to emphasize these doctrinal points. Again, how you pray is how you believe. And the kiss of peace happening before the offertory. In an informal interview with one of the priests in Milan, I asked him, we were just, with my phone outside and I've got the recording going. I'm like, why does this happen? He goes, well, it's a big thing for us Ambrosians that we have the kiss of peace before the offertory because Jesus says in Matthew's gospel, go and make peace with your brother before you go to the altar to offer a sacrifice. And in the Roman Rite, it's become a custom to think of it as the peace is the result of that offering together. Right? So a little bit of different emphases here. St. Basil of Caesarea, St. Basil the Great, emphasis on the Holy Spirit during this Arian crisis. Again, this Jesus isn't on par with God debate. And then the Syrian and Antiochian chant, which is basically, the tone doesn't sound as like clean. That doesn't seem like the right word, but the tone doesn't sound as like the Hollywood movies angelic choir, but a little bit more of like this wailing, right? For lack of a better term, Father David is getting a chuckle at that one. But with a lot of that Latin musical meter. So we've seen a lot of the ways in which there's the particularities about this rite and the ways in which it's changed. And so is preserving tradition about going back or is it looking forward? So interestingly enough, we have a case of this within Wyoming. And considering that I can see this all right, I'm just going to full screen this guy. But know that this is the original music and is still incorporated as the main melody for this as well. So this comes from Dr. Peter Kwasniewski, who is a prolific writer, and he was also a founder of the Wyoming Catholic College, and so he's done a composition in which he harmonized 3 parts of this original Ambrosian glory. That's just a couple minutes.
Oh
see that there's a lot going on, right? That's a little bit of a different from the traditional Ambrosian chant sound, but taking the traditional melody and adding more to it, and giving it that characteristic of what it originally had. So we're going to be thinking about some reversions that could happen, right? This idea of let's have all the hybridizations we want, right? Let's throw in more of this repetition, right? Let's get back to that. Let's have less of the romanization of the music within the Milanese music and the standard liturgy, right? Let's take it back to the original ones that we had inherited from our forefathers, so to speak. But there's other ways in which the Milanese can progress forward, right? Something big about coming into the vernacular. You know, the Ambrosian Mass, yes, said in Latin in one church, but in Italian in the rest of them, and even in English at some of them. That this singing and this incorporation of all the people would be very, very in line with what St. Ambrose says. Right? He thinks of the uniting under one melody, one psalm, to be that prolific life of the church. And then again, we can also look at this as a new Ambrosian identity with old motifs. Similarly to that music, moving forward, developing, not staying stuck as some time capsule, but developing forward. And then lastly, for a more Ambrosian style composition for the liturgy, rather than saying, let's rip from these other traditions, let's stay with ours and see what we can do with it. So thank you for listening. I know I'm going a little bit longer than I previously expected, but as most of you know, this tends to happen. And I am also not the greatest at graphic design, so I outsourced, and so I got to give these guys credit too. So slides go, big fan, you guys should use it sometime. And a quick thanks to the peak interviewees, at least. There's other lay people and even priests that I'd tried, like the Ambrosians. They just for some reason did not want any picture of them at all on this slide. But I thought I should give credit where credit is due, because I'm looking at liturgical documents. I obviously can't sift through everything, and a lot of these people can provide a lot of valuable resources and information. So, very own Father David Anderson and Father Rob in the room, as well as Father Brother Isaiah, if you guys had met him before, and then a couple graduates from Wyoming Catholic, one of them being a cantor, and she was very valuable for all that, and then the Master of Ceremonies, Nicola de Grandi, on the far right, who is the Master of Ceremonies, the MC at the one church that I regularly attend. Just understanding all these sides is very important to me. So there's all the text. And for any of my music nuts, you are free to go crazy. I have the Apple Music on the left and the Spotify on the right. If you don't know how to do the funny Spotify one, I got some steps right there. So I'll just open this up to any questions, comments, concerns, or anything like that for an appropriate amount of time. I'm not going to be very dogmatic on this claim for once.
I don't know if this is entirely on topic, but I had a question. Would you say that there's a difference in spirituality with the Ambrosian Church? Like are there different devotions? Like, for example, in the Roman Church, you'd have the Rosary, and a lot of Eastern churches, you'd have your prayer robe. Is there like a specific Ambrosian devotion or different spirituality, or is it more in line with the Roman spirituality?
I think it would take very heavily from the Roman tradition. One of the big things might be the liturgy of the hours is structured differently, right? So the 5 prayers that clergy and monastics are bound to be doing every single day. I've seen even with Nicola and another guy, Andrea, that they really like the particularity of the liturgy of the hours as it's formatted for the Ambrosians. But other than that, I would say by and large, they look a lot like the Romans to this day. John?
I actually have 3 questions. I'll make them quick. Did St. Ambrose found this rite himself, or is it based off his teachings of those who came after him?
Yes, so I'll just do one at a time real quick, rapid fire. We can't say for certain that St. Ambrose did, but what we know from Augustine's Confessions, at least, is that in the Church of Milan, it had already been a very proud practice for them to chant like the Easterners. Right? He says, I believe, I do have it bookmarked, I think it's book 9. Yes, book 9. He says, The Church of Milan had only recently begun to celebrate in this way for consolation and exhortation, with the brethren eagerly singing with hearts and voices together. And then he says, it was then that the practice was instituted of singing psalms and hymns in the manner of the church in the East, so that the people would not faint away for weariness in their sorrow. Part of the political conflict was that the Milanese got holed up in the cathedral, and they were basically going to be starved by the rest of them. By the rest of the political forces on the outside. So in that time, we know that St. Ambrose was teaching them how to sing songs, but in terms of like the whole, every part of everything in those liturgical documents that kind of flashed on screen, that's a little bit more tough to say, as some professors like to use. So.
Okay, and does the Rite or the church in Milan do anything special on December 8th, the feast day of St. Ambrose?
Yes, did you, sorry.
Number 7.
Yes, so there's going to be a big thing about, especially Vespers, was what the same priesthood talked to me about, the sign of peace before the offering. So I know Vespers in the Basilica of St. Ambrose is a big thing with public veneration, and there's a lot more on that than I know for sure, but it becomes a big celebration about like coming under the understanding of Ambrose as their sort of main father. And then what was the last one?
Who is the current Archbishop of the Diocese of Milan, and was he Archbishop when you went to Milan?
I think his name is Mario, and he's actually a really short dude too. And so for the feast of Corpus Domini, you know, you're going through the street, and it's like all the altar servers with the big banner tents, I don't know what the funny word is. And then there's, with the body of our Lord as Catholics believe. So, yes, and he was I don't know if he was the one pictured, I don't know if the picture was that great. But he should be the same Archbishop as when I lived there, yes. Keegan.
Has there ever been a Pope of Rome that came out of the Ambrosian Rite?
Yes, actually, yes. Okay, just want to make sure. So Pope Paul VI, who actually was the one who finished the Second Vatican Council, he used to be the Archbishop of Milan. And so part of the way in which the preservation of the Milanese tradition throughout the 20th century reforms was due to the matter of fact that the Pope at the time had once been the Archbishop of Milan. So. Zach.
So you can go to like Denver, you see a multitude of different rites that you can attend. Is there a reason that it's kind of just only in Milan right now, and has that ever been a time that it's been more widespread?
Yeah, so I'll note that it's primarily in Milan, but there are a few smaller cities. So like Tommaso, who was the interviewee in the beginning, what he had practiced was in a slightly different place called Brianza. Right, so he went to his church growing up, and it was always the Ambrosian style. And then he would go to a nearby town, and they would be doing something different. And he was like, I just thought the priest just made it up. He's like, I just thought like maybe my priest or this priest, they just like did whatever they wanted, and it was sort of a free-for-all, ironically enough. And so what you'll see is that it takes hold in Milan and like Lugano, Switzerland, right on that southern tip, and a few of the other small places around there. But when they try to import it anywhere else, it never stuck. Right? Which is kind of an interesting part about that. Charles,
How did the Second Vatican Council affect the liturgy in the same way that it did the Roman liturgy, and how was it different?
I would say it's very similar in the matter of fact that, for example, the standardization of readings becomes different. The way in which like Eucharistic reception is, you know, in one species, just in the bread, or in both the bread and the wine, is now opened up to the entire laity rather than just being reserved for the priests and main celebrants. So, yeah, I would say pretty similar. Keegan again.
Was there the doxa of being contra-Roman, as you described, did that ever cause significant contention or issues in terms of the jurisdictional and claims of power of the Bishop of Rome, especially through like the first millennium as those ideas started to become more developed and colonized?
Yeah, I can't speak too much onto the particular, I guess, political things within the Middle Ages. We're thinking just maybe like 11th, 12th century. But I know that there were a couple of popes who had tried to actually eradicate the Ambrosian Rite entirely. And so part of this doxa might be because of the matter of fact that they've just been absolutely hammered by the Roman Church. But again, we believe in this conciliar model, right, where all the bishops are acting together. And so in some sense, the Pope, while yes, per Vatican I being all this like immediate, ultimate, final jurisdiction, can't just like walk in and be like, this is how you gotta do church, right? So there's sort of the balancing of all these things.
Was there ever a time where the Ambrosian Rite, like, you know, we see a lot through the First Millennium and other jurisdictions outright denied that the Bishop of Rome had any special level of...
I mean, with the particularity, you'll see in a lot of the Eastern traditions that they don't extend during the mysteries, right? For His Holiness Leo, Pope of Rome, you know, that isn't usually put in there. But from the liturgical documents that I was able to access from an Anglican scholar, it seems as if the Ambrosian tradition does have this. So I would be inclined, at least, to think that the Archbishop of Milan and that whole Ambrosian tradition faith really did have that clinging to the Pope of Rome. But it was sort of like, you gotta understand, we have our own things.
One last one.
Does anybody have another question
Yeah.
before we let him? All right, go ahead.
Okay. Again, with the idea that they have this culture of kind of like anti-Roman, was there issues or friction that came up during the spread and implementation of the filioque in terms of liturgical use in the West?
I don't, as far as I'm aware, from the documents, the filioque, so in the creed, right, one of the big contentions was the way the creed had been formulated was, I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father. That's it, right? So there was no clause and the Son, and this has created a lot of books that are still circulating to this day. So this definition in the 4th century is changed later by Rome as a countermeasure, again, to this belief that Jesus is not on par with God the Father. And so, as far as I can tell from the liturgical documents, the Ambrosian Rite did implement this very early on. And it's very difficult to put a pin on exactly when each church implements it, because it's just sort of like yeah, this makes sense, right? And these churches go, yeah, this makes sense, and so they all start to put it in their liturgies.
Rome itself did not do it until the 10th century.
Yeah. So it becomes a very interesting conversation, and I'm sure, again, brighter minds know better than I do. Yes?
Your research question was about maintaining identity.
Yeah.
And your presentation included some changes that had happened both in during the Catholic Reformation and during the 20th century. So when we think about the identity of the Ambrosian Rite, how can people who are partial to the Ambrosian Rite or follow the Ambrosian Rite make it something more than just merely not Roman?
Right, that's one of those things of, instead of saying, like we've been seeing in Wyoming Catholic theology seminars, how can we describe even the laity within the church using positive affirmations rather than, well, they're not priests, they're not monks, they're not nuns, so what are they, right? And so I think a way in which the Ambrosians can take that identity going forward, especially it's in the name, Ambrosian, Ambrose, St. Ambrose of Milan. Right? And so it's conforming to that image of him. He's definitely got plenty of writing, some attributed to him, some a little bit more questionable, right? But there's enough source material there to actually dig that up and think about the way in which the liturgy has been prayed in likeness to his attitude, and the way that even Charles Borromeo, throughout those standardizations, really likes to bring that home as well.
I just add to that he's truly a bridge figure, because he chose being bilingual, which was becoming more and more rare in the late classical era. And so among the fathers of that time, his facility in both Latin and Greek was uncommon. And he chose, bearing in mind that when he was elected bishop, he was not even baptized. That's a story unto itself.
Yeah.
They did it quickly and all that, but he realized that he was now Archbishop of Milan, had no theological training. Where was he to get it? Well, he could have gotten it from any number of places nearby, but he chose to write to St. Basil in Cappadocia and to get his theological training in Greek from far away. So he wasn't boxed in that sense. And that's maybe a good model for Ambrosian Catholics and Roman Catholics and Byzantine Catholics and umpteen other kinds of Catholics now.
Right, yeah. No, so that's one of the big key parts too. Just a little tidbit of the history of Ambrose is that he had given a big sermon in front of all these people in Milan, and there was a child who cried out, "Ambrose for bishop!" And that's how he got elected. They were like, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. He's like, but wait, what if
He was the governor.
Yeah, he was the governor of Milan. And so they go and they thrust him into this position. He's, I think he had Christian parents, but he himself wasn't Christian. And they rushed him right into baptism, and then all of the holy orders all the way up to the rank of bishop. In a week's time.
And when they ordained a bishop, it was on December 7th, and that remained, that memory of that remained for his feast day. Usually feast days of saints is on the day of their death, but for him, the day of his consecration as bishop.
Right, so a lot of that sort of fun stuff. So yeah, definitely thinking about expanding the horizons and sort of also keeping that localized self at the same time. Anybody else? Oh, Dr. Hazel, Caleb.
Let me follow up on Tyler's question and try to translate it a little bit into a philosophical question.
Oh
So,
boy.
what does it mean to preserve the identity of a rite? How do we know? What are the success metrics? How do we know when we've succeeded or failed?
Are you asking if there's an essence to the Ambrosian Rite?
That's exactly what I'm asking.
So big philosophy of science guy. Apparently the philosophy of science has ditched this idea of the essence of something, so this is why we have to have this back and forth. So I guess it's one of those things that when we think about religion from an internal stance, right? From the Catholic point of view, the particularity about being Catholic in that sense is however the hierarchy describes it, right? There's a way in which the people are reciprocated against, but it's not entirely to the individual practitioner to decide how things go, right? You don't get old church council Susan who goes, I think we should do this during Mass, and then it happens, right? There's something about the way in which the structure goes back and forth, right? There's the reception of understanding, listening to these people who are the practitioners, who are not anything like a priest or a bishop. But it ultimately all hangs in balance with sort of this communal aspect where we understand that the heads are sort of the ones that are implementing that from that top down. Keeping in mind the experience of everybody at the bottom as well, right? And so I think the best way that you can get it is in something like official statements, right? That's by and large been what the influence of standardization of liturgy over time has been in understanding local customs and cultures and sort of being like, yes, this is now something that's able to be practiced. Right? We even see this in the Roman Rite with North Africa, right? I think the Zer Rite, I always have a problem with trying to figure out how to pronounce this, but they become so distinct enough away from the Roman Rite that they were granted their own type of liturgical setting, which is very, very similar, but in some way a little bit different. So, tough to say. There's a lot going on, but I would say that looking at the hierarchical as like the primary with all these other things also being very important to consider is how we can sort of establish that. And I think it becomes, very in line with how do I know this? Well, it just seems obvious to me, right? Again, this idea of this identity that just runs so deep that we don't even consciously make ourselves aware of it. Is that suitable?
Yeah, I've got follow-ups, but I'll open back to the room for sure.
Yeah, Nick.
Thank you, Ramsey. So you mentioned a number of times this controversy, should we Romanize, should we keep our identity? Obviously you're siding with Ambrose, it sounds like, to keep the identity. But why? What's the benefit of maintaining this rite? Obviously, those who would like to Romanize it have good reasons for that as well. Yeah.
I like this. This is adding some spice. So one of those things, barring all of the public university baggage of big bad Roman Catholic Church, thinking about why it should be kept around, I think, is one of those things that even in my interview with Pietro Cardinal Parolin, this idea of the garden that blooms with many, many flowers, right? All of these flowers very different, but all of them very beautiful in their own ways, right? And so I think there's a sort of enrichment that is had with the multiplicity of expressions of faith, right? And especially something that isn't like in direct countering to what you might say the structure of the Catholic Church and the way in which she teaches doctrine for the practitioners, right? Thinking about the sort of benefit that the Ambrosian Rite as a particular practice has, I think that that enriches the Church's life even more. And so I'd be inclined to say, I guess from again, my personal semi-confessional point of view, that it would be a very enriching thing for the whole Church to keep a multiplicity of expressions, that being one of them. You can pop back to Caleb then, if you want to do your follow-ups.
So you mentioned I'm a philosopher of science. So Darwin said of species, right? That the definition of species is whatever a competent taxonomist says a species is. Are you making the same sort of move for the Ambrosian Rite here?
It's something like that. I think it's different because something about like religious faith is how like personal it is, right? There's all sorts of like doctrines and decrees about everything that you can get from like Genesis to Revelation, right? But there's something about the way in which people practice that isn't exactly accessible to anybody else, right? And so as long as these things are staying in accord with reason, right, and thinking about what many of the classical theologians have thought of as like being in line with reason is being in line with reality, which is being in line with goodness, right? So far as these things are rooted in reason, rooted in the true, the good, and the beautiful, a contentious claim nowadays, that is how one can understand the faith in a good manner, right? We think about, even with patron saints, I often use this analogy of explaining why it is that Catholics and Orthodox have patron saints. And so there's all sorts of good food, right? You have American good food, debatably. You have European good food. You have Chinese, Japanese, Korean. You have Australian Aboriginal good food, right? All of these things are all good food in their own ways, but they're all a little distinct from one another. And I think that that's a good way of thinking about it. Something like an analogy to that. Anybody else? Xavier.
What? So I came in a bit later.
You're good, no
and
worries.
from what I am hearing, it sounds like a lot of the Ambrosian Rite would be very, like, basically Protestantism if they follow core Catholic beliefs.
So one of the important things, again, is to remember that the Archbishop of Milan has his own personal jurisdiction of Milan and how that operates, right? So in some sense, these things all need to be working together, right? All these bishops need to be coming together with all their practice and doctrine and all these things. But in some ways, the bishop also has his own proper place in which it is not for someone else to tell him what to do, right? And again, we don't think of like, at least again within the Catholic structure of things, we don't think of the Pope as like God-man running around big like, dogma, 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 this is what you need to do, this is what you need to do, right? Because quite frankly, I mean, even from a practical level, the Pope don't got time for that, right? So even from, you might say, from that higher theological standpoint, it would never be in the place of outside bishops to really restrict and define exactly how a bishop practices and how he has everybody else practice, because part of that is, again, organic, and it develops from how they receive the faith. Oh, actually, no, we're going to go with Alex, because you tried.
I'm curious on how much you said that St. Ambrose studied the Greek, and how often did he go to, I guess, the Byzantine Empire, and how much did Eastern theology affect his kind of outlook on things?
I might turn this over to Father David if he wants to speak on this, because he did translate Basil's word.
Yes, he did. It's remarkable that in his hymns, you know, it's surprising that someone who had the position of consular governor of Milan is suddenly baptized, becomes Archbishop of Milan, and then occupies his people who are having a sit-in a church that the emperor's mother-in-law, who was an Arian Goth, wanted to be turned over to the Arians, and the phrase that we still have in English, "don't give an inch," comes from Ambrose. "I will not give the Arians an inch," he said, because they denied that the Son of God was consubstantial with the Father, God in the same way as the Father is God, and that very precise incarnational and Trinitarian theology certainly Ambrose imbibed from his mentor, St. Basil, and others as well. So I mean, that's just one example of it. But it comes up in his hymns. He uses those hymns, which are not written in Greek, they're written in Latin. But, so again, I use the expression bridge figure. His hymns express the genius of Greek theology in Latin. And he's one of not too many people to be very good at that. As you know, the now very well-known saying of Pope John Paul II, he was a two-lunged breather. Although perhaps in the 4th century, the distance between Greek East and Latin West was not quite as much. I mean, cultural, linguistic, theological distance, not so much as it became later when the two tried to continually outsmart each other.
It's maybe a silly question.
No silly questions, Jen.
Is the Archbishop of Milan appointed by the Pope, or is that like a different process? Like, how does that?
So, this is where my ecclesiology, especially in the modern day, sometimes I get confused with how exactly cardinal signing and something go and all this sort of stuff. But you do need at least another bishop to appoint a bishop. And you might be able to speak again on this a little bit better than me. But the appointment of the Archbishop comes from directly the Vatican, or is it just bishops?
I don't know the answer to
That's
that.
a much
The Pope approves all appointments
Right,
of bishops in the Roman Rite. Now, whether there's some special aspects of that for a place like Milan, I don't know. There could be.
Right. I'm of the same opinion. I have not been made aware of any particularity about it, but it's totally possible. Yeah, John.
I was just going to say that I don't know too much about the Ambrosian Rite or the current Archbishop, but I just looked it up and it says that he was appointed by Pope Francis.
Okay, yeah, there we go. All right, any others? Is that a good one? So we're keeping everybody else here.
It's a good one.
Yeah. Okay.
It's very tangential to what Father David was just talking about, specifically about the Greek influence on both the liturgy and theology. Last year, Pope Leo, during the celebration of the Eastern churches, made a comment about how the Western Church, specifically the Roman Church, can benefit from the reverence and the mysticism in both the liturgy and theology of the East. And it sounds like, to a certain degree, the Ambrosian Rite did that and continues to do that. So, in that sense, what can the Roman Church learn from the Ambrosian Church?
Ooh, that's a good one. Yeah, okay, that is a very time, I think. So what the Ambrosian Church can learn from, what the Roman Church can learn from the Ambrosian Church, I think is a particularity about thinking about what exactly makes us Roman, right? One of the great thinkers that we were looking at in theory of religion last semester, she was talking about how to find one's identity was to look through the other to find the self. Right? So it's actually in seeing the differences in someone next to you that you can actually understand what it is that makes you particular. Right? Like if I'd been raised with people that were all brown curly hair, I would never even think about other types of hair, right? Or I don't wear glasses. If I come across someone for the first time who wears glasses, I'm like, whoa, Right? So there's certain ways in which these checkups can really give us an understanding of like what it is to mean, particularly being something like a Roman Catholic. Yeah. All right. Any other buzzer beaters? All right, we'll stop it there.